So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us at this third conversation series. And this series are powered by Cisco, and we'll thank Charmaine again very much for the support on that one. A special welcome to our guests, Ms. Tamara Brahm and Ms. N. Gituku Shongwe, and also to our Deputy Chair of the Leadership Committee, Trifosa. She will later facilitate this session today. So you will all agree with me that we are in a crisis. Our President Cyril Ramaphosa articulated it very well when he said we are dealing with two viruses. Not only do we have COVID-19 pandemic, but we have a gender-based violence scourge. As members of IWFSA, we have recognized this, we have acknowledged it, and then we want to now take decisive action to address the challenge. So today, we will receive an update on the steps taken this far by government, civil society, and business, and also obtain an international perspective of how this problem is addressed, because it is not only a South African problem, it is a global pandemic as well. So just for the updating our members, these conversations are aimed at upskilling us, and also so that we keep abreast with developments in all issues that matter to us. And that will enable us to have a proper engagement with the issues, contribute meaningfully as a voice of women in all things that matter. So without any further ado, I will welcome again Ms. Trifosa Ramano, who will facilitate the session and introduce our guest speakers. I will also ask Ms. Ramano to close the session at the end. Thank you very much.
Futhi, and good afternoon to the members, and good afternoon to our esteemed guest, Ms. Tamara Brahm and Ms. N. Gituku Shongwe, for agreeing to participate in our session today of gender-based violence. Just to start, our President, Irene Chanley, who has sent her apologies today, recently wrote an opinion piece, and that today we are addressing a critical, ever-present issue affecting society, individual society as a whole, which is gender-based violence. In a recent opinion piece that our President, Irene Chanley, mentioned that gender-based violence cannot be attributed to a single factor, but it is often an interplay of individual, community, economic, cultural, and religious interactions at different levels in society. As COVID-19 pandemic continues to have a devastating impact on the lives of people all over the world, our Rainbow Nation, the horrific prospect of a shadow pandemic of gender-based violence hovers around us. So today, we welcome again Ms. Tamara Brahm, who has recently taken the position as a generation equality and gender-based violence specialist located in the presidency, and Ms. N. Gituku Shongwe, representative from the UN Women Multi-Country Office, SAMCO, who is responsible for women empowerment and gender equality in various SADC countries, including Botswana, Lesotho, and Swaziland. So welcome, my guest. So today, we just want to unpack the gender-based violence. Maybe I should start with you, Mr. Tamara Brahm. Maybe if you can give us the lay of the ground, given that there was a summit in November 29 hosted by the president, and then there was also an interim steering committee that was established out of that summit to deal with the gender-based violence. And then there's a report which was submitted to the presidency, and it was submitted to the cabinet. Just share with us the lay of the ground and the cabinet approving the national strategic priorities in March or April. Can I hand over to you, Mr. Mara?
Thank you very much for that introduction. And also thank you very much to the International Women's Forum South Africa for inviting me to be part of, I think, a very important conversation at a very crucial time. I think in the introductory remarks, there was a bit of reflection on the period we're moving through of heightened uncertainty, of extreme levels of fear and a sense of helplessness and a lack of power over external factors. And I think as we sit around this virtual table, I know that many of us continue to be called on to shed light on, to lead, to respond to what we're confronted with. And I think it's in a very similar way that when we look at gender-based violence and femicide in the country, we're called on to respond in a similar way. The brutality of rapes and murders of women and girls that we've been continuously confronted with, the misogyny underlying these acts, the levels of impunity have left many of us feeling overwhelmed, angry, deeply disturbed, shocked and saddened, and the list can go on of the effect that that has on all of us. The NSP really emerged in response to this reality. And I'm starting maybe at the end of your comments, Ms. Romano, when you spoke about the NSP, and then I'll move a bit backwards and forwards. So the NSP emerged in response to this reality. It's a document that set out to develop a pathway of collective hope. It wants to move us from a place of deep pain to a place of promise, from a place of trauma towards a place of healing, and from a place of fear towards a place of safety, from a place of being brutalized and dehumanized to a place of rehumanization, respect, and freedom for women, children, and LGBTQIA+ persons, and indeed everybody in our country. And I think on the cover of the NSP, those areas are captured. And so in this presentation, I want to talk a little bit about the context to the NSP and reflect a bit on the process and a bit of the analysis of gender-based violence in the country, and what the response has been in terms of a theory of change underlying the NSP, and what that could mean in terms of implementation of it and moving it forward. So starting off with context, I think in the analysis underlining, and I think just commenting on how we got to the NSP, I think we saw in August 2018 a range of activists demonstrating against gender-based violence organized by the hashtag Total Shutdown movement. And these protests were all over the country. Arising from these protests, a process was set in motion of bringing civil society, researchers, and different government departments together to work collectively to put the presidential summit in place, which took place on the 1st and 2nd of November 2018. And I think these processes are important because there's been responses to gender-based violence, both at the level of civil society as well as the state and other actors over many years. But I think what that process did in 2018 was really to usher in a greater sense of urgency And I think one of the very positive elements that emerged from that process was the working together, the multi-sectoral response, which I think very much aligns with the President's remarks around the interplay of different factors. And so I think one of the unique and important parts of that process was civil society worked collectively with other stakeholders, with government, to feed into the different commissions in the presidential summit. And all of this shapes the context for where we are now and what is in the document. And so through the different commissions and the baseline documents that were done at the time, these all fed into the discussions at the presidential summit. And those discussions then resulted in the declaration which emerged from the summit, which consists of 19 articles. And that declaration provides the foundation for the National Strategic Plan, which is the roadmap moving forward to respond to gender-based violence in the country. And I think we've all been part of strategic processes in our different organizations, in our different workplaces. I think some of the elements of the NSP that make it unique is that it responded to a range of voices from the ground, that it built onto an identified need by government, organized civil society, and different stakeholders. A diagnostic review of violence against women and children, state programming took place, and the report was released in 2016. And it also identified that one of the weaknesses in the response was this lack of strategic cohesion of the country moving in the same direction collectively. And so the NSP was developed in a multi-sectoral way with extensive consultations and engagement. And I think that's a very useful foundation for where we find ourselves, because it provides a foundation of wide ownership. As we speak today, a number of civil society organizations have been involved in a process of better understanding the document and looking at what their specific role is in moving it forward. And I think there have been a number of other groups. The UN Women has been involved in working with the faith-based sector. The Department of Women has been involved in engaging a number of groups to look at what is our role in moving the National Strategic Plan forward. I think some of the contributions that the National Strategic Plan has also made in relation to our understanding of gender-based violence is important. So I think through the NSP, the understanding has been broadened to encompass structural drivers, including economic factors. It's also been broadened to include violence as a result of sexual orientation and gender identity. And it's also very deliberately looked at the common drivers of violence against children as critical elements of a prevention agenda. The analysis underlying the NSP has very much been about understanding the scale of violence, of gender-based violence, the magnitude of the problem in South Africa. And the data is captured in the NSP, and we can refer people to where you can actually get the NSP. But for example, with South Africa having 5 times the rate of femicide as the global average, and there are a range of other indicators that talk to the levels of violence in the country. But again, as the facilitator was saying at the outset, it's not only a South African problem, it's a global problem. But we're sitting with a massive problem in South Africa. Gender inequality as a key driver of the problem, in understanding it. Also our history of institutionalized violence through the apartheid state and responses to that state, in which violence has been integrally woven into our social fabric. Also the overall levels of crime and violence in South Africa, which are significant. And all of this aligns with the white paper on safety and security, which talks about a whole of society approach. So very much the approach in the NSP talks about a whole society approach, and an approach where we need to look at how do we reweave the social fabric. And the process of pulling the NSP together as well was a very consultative process. It involved going to a range of communities across the country and engaging with a key question: what is it that we need to do to respond to this crisis? What are some of the gaps? What is missing? And I think alongside the presidential summit, alongside a range of workshops, critical issues emerged, and those really shaped the pillars of the NSP and our understanding of what the priorities need to be in the next 10 years and in the next 5 years. And some of the elements that have emerged was the need for an effective criminal justice system, a need to address women's economic vulnerability, issues around policing, around safe transport, lighting, the impact of alcohol and drugs at the community level, the need for us to look at social norms and at parenting interventions. So those are some of the areas that emerged from these many discussions that we had across the country. And so the roadmap is really that was launched by the president on the 30th of April and was approved in cabinet in March 2020, is really a multi-sectoral, coherent, strategic policy and programming framework to ensure that we have a coordinated national response to the chronic crisis of gender-based violence and femicide, both by the government as well as by the country as a whole. And so a number of the principles that are critical in how we move the document forward relate to, for example, a multi-sectoral approach of harnessing the responsibilities, the resources, and the commitment across government departments, across different tiers of government, across civil society, across movements, across development agencies, across the private sector, of us all moving forward together, looking at how we complement and augment existing interventions that are already in place, and really looking for a visionary, gender transformative and responsive approach that takes to move this agenda forward. Also looking at mutual accountability and looking at strengthening how we measure those changes. Are we meeting the kinds of changes that we've articulated in the NSP? And importantly, looking at the principle of inclusiveness, embracing our diversity and intersectionality, and making sure that as we move this document and these outcomes forward, that we also foreground the women's experiences most marginalized by poverty, by age, by ableness, by sexual orientation, and gender identity. So the vision is really a for South Africa free from gender-based violence directed at women, children, and LGBTQIA+ persons. And the central thread in terms of the pathway to change to get us from where we are now to where we need to go is really around three key areas. The one's around accountability, the one is around strengthening responsiveness, and the other one is around prevention. And these three threads really form the foundation of the 6 pillars in the National Strategic Plan. And I'm going to talk a little bit to that, to those different pillars, and what that could mean for us moving forward. So the first pillar is on accountability, coordination, and leadership. And what we're saying we want to see in the next 5 years is bold leadership and strengthened accountability across government and society. And that bold leadership is about talking out boldly in relation to gender-based violence, challenging incidents of gender-based violence, making sure that we have systems in place that vets public officials, that make sure those in the religious sector, those in the media, those in the private sector, those in civil society are held accountable for actions. So the issue of being bold, is critical in terms of reshaping a different social milieu and at the same time ensuring accountability. The second element of that pillar speaks to strengthened coordination and multi-sectoral collaboration and coordination, making sure that we pool our different resources together, our different skills, our different understandings, our different experiences, and using that as a very important kernel for how we move this agenda forward. The second area is around prevention and rebuilding social cohesion, which is the area which has the most number of short-term outcomes over the next 5 years, and it's multifaceted. It speaks to firstly strengthen delivery capacity in South Africa to roll out evidence-based prevention interventions. So really, this pillar is about saying we need to stop this tide of gender-based violence and femicide in the country. And so we need to build the capacity of the state, of society, to be able to take a prevention agenda forward. We need to look at how to change social norms within key groups and roll those out. Groups such as schools, higher learning institutions, and communities more broadly. We need to shift away from toxic masculinities. We need to understand how to do that. We need to look at rolling out programs, for example, strengthened programs in relation to fathering, but also understanding those toxic masculinities and finding ways to deal with that and to shift. We also need to look at harnessing violence against children programs that have an impact on gender-based violence prevention. And that's important because we see an intergenerational impact of gender-based violence. We know the impact of gender-based violence is very significant in our country. It's for individual women in terms of their health, in terms of their mental well-being, in terms of their socioeconomic status. It's also an impact at an intergenerational level in terms of children growing up in households like that. And so the importance of really understanding and linking with violence against children program is critical. We also need to look at how do we situate gender-based violence prevention programs within wider prevention programs on violence and crime, also in terms of violence against LGBTQIA+ persons at a community level, so that we see all of this, we're shifting attitudes, we're shifting norms, and we see all of this as part of building a different social milieu. And then the other areas under this pillar that talk to making public spaces safe, strengthening programming that rebuilds human dignity and social cohesion in our communities. And then pillar 3 is on justice, safety, and protection. And that's really around how survivors are able to access an effective, an efficient, sensitive criminal justice system that's accessible and responsive. It's about strengthening capacity within the criminal justice system to address all impunity and effectively respond to gender-based violence and facilitate justice. We know that there's been a big call for strengthening the criminal justice system, and then amending legislation related to GBV areas. And then pillar 4 is on response care and support, which is on the one hand, strengthening existing response care and support services by the state in ways that are victim-centered around the needs of the victim, but also survivor-focused to really facilitate recovery and healing. And this pillar deliberately adds the concept of healing. In many of our consultations and our work in this area, many people raise the importance of focusing on healing, of healing the brokenness in our communities, the brokenness at an individual level and at a wider social level. And so this pillar, and not only this pillar, but a theme across the NSP is also to look at how we provide services, in what we do, how are we promoting healing. And another element to this pillar is addressing secondary victimization, which survivors experience when they do access services. And a lot of that secondary victimization also relates to service providers not being supported and, and often not debriefing and not being supported. And so another element within the NSP is calling for us to do that, which is also part of that wider healing agenda. We also want victims to feel supported by the system to access what they need to help them along their healing journey. And the last element in this pillar is around strengthening community and institutional responses to provide integrated care and support. And within this pillar, we also look at the workplace, and we look at how can workplaces be used as spaces as well to really support response, care, healing, and other elements. The fifth pillar is on economic power. And this is a pillar that links to the Article 19 of the Declaration, where economic empowerment emerged as a very strong theme in looking at how we respond to gender-based violence. The importance of the economic drivers, economic inequality as a driver of gender-based violence, which impacts on women's social and economic position in society, and also a factor that increases women's vulnerability to violence. And so under this pillar, the one key area, and I know my colleague Anne's going to talk a lot more to this in detail, but the pillar talks to accelerated initiatives that can address women's unequal economic and social position through access to government and private sector procurement, employment, housing, etc., and other income generation initiatives. The second area talks to safe workplaces that are free of violence against women and LGBTQIA plus persons, but not limited to sexual harassment, but making workplaces safe, with sexual harassment being one key element. It also talks to demonstrated commitment through policy interventions by South African state, private sector, and other stakeholders to eliminate the impact of the economic drivers of gender-based violence. And the whole principle of equal work for equal pay fits into this particular area. And then the last pillar is on research and information management, and it's really three areas there. The one is about improving our national understanding of the extent of gender-based violence, as well as the nature of gender-based violence broadly as a country, but also then in relation to specific groups and specific forms of gender-based violence that we might not know as much as we need to know about. The second one is about adopting policies and programs that are informed by existing evidence-based research. And the third area is about strengthening information systems across government so that they can be used to address systemic challenges and also facilitate effective solutions. So it's strengthening the systems to do that. And within those pillars, I think there are a number of questions we could ask that are relevant, I think, for our conversation. So for pillar one, how can we show bold leadership in challenging gender-based violence from where we are? How can we ensure workplaces, public offices are held accountable? How can we make workplaces safe and sexual harassment free? How can we feed into supporting national coordination and multi-sectoral coordination and resourcing in terms of the kind of structural formations with the council? What is our role within that? And then when we look at other areas, the prevention pillar, I think some of the key questions on the prevention pillar would be, sorry, I've just lost my train. What role can we play to support the prevention agenda in the country, the building of capacity around prevention? What kind of partnerships are required to support the integration, for example, of prevention into IDPs, into local initiatives? And there are a number of actual points, very specific points in the plan that I think are useful to look at. And I'd captured some slides which I'll send through and which can be shared. So they're very specific references, for example, to the private sector, both across the pillars, which can be then looked at in a lot more detail. Then if you look...
Thank you very much. Yes, Ms. Tamara, we will get to that in terms of the questions. Thank you very much for unpacking those 6 pillars. I just want to give Ms. Anne an opportunity to respond to these pillars, and especially the economic power with regards to the gender-based violence in the workplace. And also to share with us some of the global best practices that we can actually share with the members with regard to that gender-based violence. So over to you, Ms. Anne.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kiposa, and to you, Tamara, for setting the foundation so strong. Thank you. So this is a very exciting conversation to have with women who are in business and women who are, from different workplaces, who are not the usual ones that we are having the same conversation with in civil society and government. And so I'm excited that we're going to have renewed energy from new sources with this work. So I think the important thing is that this framework that Tamara has shared is such an important one because we have clarity now. There are 6 areas, and if you want to figure out and find a space for yourself, we all have a place to be. The first one around accountability and leadership, this is something that we discovered very, very quickly at UN Women, that we did an assessment last year of every single country in the world that is a member of the United Nations, did a review of 25 years since the Beijing Platform for Action. And the Beijing Platform for Action is a sort of blueprint for gender equality and women's empowerment from the 1995 Beijing conference. So country after country did reviews of their performance. And this is where we get the kind of data that you hear us quoting all over the world, that at the current pace that we are progressing in terms of gender equality and women's empowerment, it will take us 217 years before we achieve gender equality. In some instances, it's 700 years, depending on the sector. And the reason we're saying this is because we have done as women, and your question was about women in society. We as women have done so much work in terms of empowering ourselves. The first thing was empowerment. And then, get involved, invest, and do all kinds. So women have been very, very engaged. What we found as a summary of these reports from across the world is that the missing link is the stereotypes and norms that persist amongst men in particular. So patriarchy, as we call it here, it's not used as much in other countries, but in South Africa, we call it very boldly, which is great. So this is almost like the last place where we need to really invest in unstereotyping institutions, pervasive gender inequality practices, and real attitudes and norms and practices from institutions to society, our own sons and daughters, our own sons and fathers and husbands, So challenging this. So this first pillar on accountability and leadership is crucial. And so we established the He for She initiative as one of our vehicles to bring men on board. And the key thing with He for She was we started with impact champions, heads of state, company CEOs. And the idea was to challenge them to say, if you take leadership from the top, does it change behavior within the company? And we've done assessments of that. And I'll just give you an example of how at a country level, in Malawi, with all these issues, President Mutharika was under huge pressure to change the policy around child marriage, which they did in Malawi. In companies, we have De Beers and Standard Bank who are part of these impact champions. And we are tracking them. We are in conversations with them regularly to see what kind of shift in behavior we start seeing within the culture of the organization. So the really placing the responsibility squarely in the lap of male leaders is crucial. And advocating for that is something that we can all do as women. You heard of the famous Google walkout where there was a massive sexual harassment case at Google. And what happened then was because of the undue pressure from the outside, the board basically gave them a massive handshake for them to leave quietly and sort of leave out. But that's when staff then walked out and said, nope, you are not going to reward sexual harassment in the workplace. So accountability, accountability, accountability and leadership are huge. And we've done our work. We should continue to advocate for it. But where we have male leaders, they have to show a difference and leadership from the top. Where we have female leaders, obviously, their performance is always expected to be even higher, but really making sure that we walk through the entire institution to build the kind of policy that enables staff at all levels to access justice for themselves. We partner with the ILO on the Global Convention on sexual, it's on violence and harassment in the workplace. You can Google it actually. And we have some almost mock policy documents that we can share with any of you who may be interested in that. But it basically is looking at all the multiple forms of justice that you can find, but importantly, making sure that we're leading from the front. I want to continue on this point that Tamara raised about prevention. Prevention in terms of gender-based violence has been very, very weak. And if you think about how we do our gender-based violence work in South Africa, it's always about where is the police, where are the social workers, what's happening with the GBV command center. These are all response-based. But we need to prevent it before it even happens. And so a lot of the work, and again, going back to my point about stereotypes and social norms, this is where a lot of work with men, with institutions, with communities are crucial. So some of the examples of the things we're doing, and these are ways in which you could actually be thinking about this, is with this he for she context program, we have been running initiatives with different partners in taverns in South Africa. And those taverns basically have continuous dialogues with men about abuse and what is acceptable or not acceptable. And we have actually seen shifts in behavior. There's a famous program started out in Uganda for HIV called Stepping Stones. And this is an initiative that focuses primarily on men and the behavior of men, particularly perpetrators of violence. And it does several things. One is really force an introspection and reflection, but the other is to place heavy responsibility on the community around you to hold you accountable for your behavior. So one of the things, we did a study here on bystanderism, and we found that there is it was between here, Georgia, and several other countries in the world, and we found that this culture of bystanderism is particularly strong in South Africa. People know who the perpetrators are. People know who's being abused. But we do what we just watch and we turn our heads away, just as the police do, and say it's a domestic matter. This is one of the areas in our conversations with the NSP implementation team. This is one of the areas that has to drive fast. And South Africa was a sterling example across the world in terms of street committees. You built street committees in anti-apartheid days. Those street committees, toppled a massive government. Surely, if we did street committees so that in every single street, every village, every ward, every community, we know who is perpetrating, who is being violated, and we're taking action immediately, that's what would work. So in terms of the response, we need to be sure that we're looking at the entire ecosystem of response, not focusing it on 2 or 3 structures. And this is what we've learned globally, is to build an effective and comprehensive ecosystem that will prevent and respond at the lowest level possible. So if you live in a particular community, or you're from a particular township or rural community where you have family, make sure that everybody there is connected to one another and that they know who is the local police person, who are the social workers, who are the health people around us, that we can actually make sure that every single woman who needs to raise her hand to report a case has a place to go. Right now, what we find is that there's huge bottlenecks just for women to be able to report. And everybody is waiting for the police to do something about it. But the police have got their own inefficiencies, and we know all about that. So this is what globally for us is, what does that ecosystem really look like for response, from the justice system to the police to the different helplines and so on. So we've been really trying to drive new thinking at that level, where we move the responsibility from saying we're waiting on government to making sure that every single faith institution has mapped out this country. We know there's about 10 to 20 churches or faith organizations that are based in every single ward in this country. There is no reason why that whole network of organizations would not form a GBV community response system. And so that's one thing that for us is a big one. Let me talk about economic power.
Okay.
In terms of economic power, I think really the most important thing is that we have women empowerment principles which we can share with you. And with the women empowerment principles, which are global, and many companies in South Africa, we have 59 companies that are signatories to them. What we find is that leadership becomes the focus, a little bit of tokenism in terms of a few women on boards, but it doesn't translate very often to your spend. And it doesn't translate to ensuring that you are buying from women-owned businesses, that you are making sure that in every single investment that is being made in terms of the economy, that it is enabling women to remove vulnerability from gender-based violence as much as possible. So there's a whole series of work around what works to end gender-based violence. In that, what works to end gender-based violence, the most important things, we're focusing on the perpetrator to prevent the cases from happening, and building the economic power of women so that they have the options. And we know that options are not the entire story, and that some women who are very powerful also are victims of violence. But it reduces vulnerability if you have choices. And so there's a lot of work that we've been doing in terms of economic power, and in particular with women in the informal sector, really trying to move as much resources into their hands as we can, so that we have real ability to sort of act and move women out of the contexts where they are. In fact, right now there's big conversations about why is it that women are the ones who have to move out of their house when they are abused, and that in fact it should be men who do this. The biggest issue we find in our research across the world is that economic vulnerability is what removes the option for women to even debate whether men should stay in or leave. But I think for those of you in business, it's important that you see principle number 5, which is about supply chain and enterprise development, as a GBV response, because that's what it is. It is a GBV response because it is moving economic power from where it is to where it should be, and really focusing on reducing that economic vulnerability. And so we are tracking this across the world, and we are beginning to see some very strong results. The last point I'll raise is that we've pulled together another initiative called the Unstereotype Alliance. The Unstereotype Alliance, and some of you may know of it and may be members of it, is our attempt to pull together those who shape and influence culture. Pop culture, media, film, advertising, those who cause us to buy stuff which we don't need, but we buy because somehow we've been convinced by advertising agencies. They form culture and they shape a lot of the sort of patriarchal culture that we have. So we are now working with them to force them and encourage them, incentivize them, inspire them to change stereotypes that have been perpetuated over such a long time. Hip-hop artists being challenged to move away from the kind of language that is used. And so we here in South Africa, as part of the prevention work, are working with the creative industry, with advertising companies, to make sure that they help us to shape messaging in ways in which, when we watch those Nike ads, we always think to ourselves, yeah, I could do that. So the idea really for women and society is that you have many spaces to enter this gender-based violence space, the NSP has given us a fantastic platform, and we have global best practice that shows us where we can actually succeed. So over to you, Triforsa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. N. The supply chain as a GBV response, I like that. There are a number of questions from the floor. If I can read them so that you can respond to them. There's a one that says, how will courts or justice system be strengthened to address this pandemic? Or is prosecution not a deterrent? The second one is, how can we strengthen process involving children and vulnerable women, availability and accessibility of safe houses for immediate relief? And then the third one is that what infrastructure can we implement in place to aid to PTSD and mental health support system for victims of violence? And then the other one is just more of a comment that we need to make sure that IWFS members get represented and to provide input in each of those pillars that Mr. Mara has actually highlighted. So if I can hand over to you, Mr. Mara and Ms. N, to respond to some of these questions in here. Who would like to go first? Mr. Mara? Mr. Mara? Maybe Anne,
Hello?
can you? Hello, Mr. Mara? Are you back?
Hello? Hello?
Hello? Yes. I have raised a couple of questions that came from the floor. The one is relating to the justice system. And the other one is, how can we strengthen processes involving children and vulnerable women in terms of availability and accessibility to safe houses? And the other one is about what infrastructure can we implement in place to aid mental health support system for victims of GBV?
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I've also got load shedding, so I thank you for repeating it. I think just starting with the last question around availability to support mental health issues. I think in the NSP, we actually talk, and I think for me, this is one of the critical elements, and it links to what Anne was saying earlier on, is in the NSP, we talk about circles of healing, and we talk about rapid response teams at a community level. And we also talk about how do we actually build the infrastructure within our communities, drawing on faith-based structures, drawing on community groups, drawing on structures that are already providing support. How do we bolster and support those initiatives so that we can respond and provide that mental health support? And I think the idea of the circles of healing as well, it also refers to the different levels of trauma that survivors face, their families face, but also, you know, some of the kind of mental health challenges also at the community level that also drive the levels of gender-based violence that we have. So we know, for example, from a study that was conducted in 2017, that a very high percentage of the men involved in the study and involved in gender-based violence, you know, suffered from depression and suffered from substance abuse. So there's a need to both, and this talks to Pillar 4, there's a need to both strengthen existing services, but also to very consciously build the social infrastructure so that we have, you know, more support. In terms of sheltering services, the diagnostic review also highlighted that a very high percentage, I think it's, I don't want to quote an incorrect percentage, but a high percentage of services provided to survivors, including sheltering services, are provided by civil society organizations. And so there's a need on the one hand to really support and in the NSP there is also a deliverable around putting the infrastructure in place and in the form of fund, etc., to really beef up and strengthen the support for civil society organizations providing services. So I think that's the one element. The other element has also been, and this was also in the Emergency Response Action Plan, where the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure was making spaces available, buildings available that could be used for sheltering. But I think there is a lot of complexity around that as well, because it's not only about the building, it's also about how one then makes that building space available for accessible, how one actually takes a building and transforms it into a sheltering space, because there are a number of elements, and I think there's engagement between the Department of Social Development. I'm not sure where that process is now, but I think that's some of the thinking around that. And just also linking to what Anne was saying earlier, there's also a lot of discussion, and through the NSP, some of these discussions have happened at the community level about women leaving their space, and, you know, as opposed to men being taken out of that space so that women and children can remain in it. But again, there are, and men being taken to a police station, etc. But again, there are a number of complexities around that. What was the law? What was the question on justice?
Thank you. The one is that how do you strengthen the criminal justice system? So maybe
Okay.
in that, maybe how you can respond is that there was in a recent response to a recent parliamentary question, the Justice Minister Ronald Lamula said the Department of Justice drafted 3 bills, aimed at capping the scourge of violence against women and children. Would you like to talk about what those bills are and how far are they? Because of the amending the legislation and the framework was one of the key aspects that came out of the summit.
Okay, so I think there are a number of bills before Parliament. The one is the Cyber Crimes Bill, and that was debated by the Select Committee on Security and Justice. There's a Prevention and Combating of Hate Crimes and Speech Bill. There's the Recognition of Customary Marriage Bill. I'm just looking at a report that was done recently, and the Traditional Courts Bill before the Select Committee. So those are some of the bills. There's the Domestic Violence Act. There's a process of amending the Domestic Violence Act. And the second bill proposed the amendment of Chapter 6 of the Criminal Law Sexual Offences and Related Matters Act of 2007. Yeah. So those are some of the bills. So there are a number of bills that are currently being discussed.
Okay, thank you very much. In terms of the IWFSA, women from corporates from different walks of life, how can the members of IWFSA play a role in all the different pillars out of the different priorities, especially the one that Ms. N spoke about of the economic power, and I like the supply chain as a GBV response, is that how can we play a role as IWFSA? One of the things that comes to my mind is in terms of your CPIC, that if maybe one can recommend that if the perpetrators of GBV they are you know they are accused or convicted of the GBV, they should not be board members, they should not be leaders, they should not be any leadership position, and we should amend the Companies Act and the CPIC to make sure that we mean business with regard to GBV. Would you like to respond to that, both yourself and Tamara?
Sure. I think it's really such an important issue, and I commend you for even thinking about it, because it is something that we are doing across the world. One of the big areas, and I know South Africa has started to do this, is about registers of offenders, like a sexual offenders register, and that sexual offenders register becomes like bad credit. So it basically is supposed to influence everything that you do. Because you're an offender, you know, it goes into that database that has all kinds of information about Trifota's life, no matter where she is. And so it does impact, like you would have a criminal record, and it would impact on your ability to be able to join a board and so on. So I know that South Africa has started some work on a sexual offenders register, but it's work that we want to strengthen, that we need to strengthen. It's work that we do across the world as UN Women, and we want to be able to strengthen that here. So I think the idea of a sexual offenders register for the private sector would be very good to do, because you know, it's very important that we start recording these cases, and that people are not moving around from one organization to the next. We have something in the UN that is called, that's basically called a personal check. So if you are applying for a job, if there has ever been any abuse anywhere and there's been any report of you, it becomes there's a record. So you can't then, you know, because previously what the UN has done is that you know, a man you know, has a case and it gets too ugly, so he quits and he moves to another office. He's just transferred to another office. So we now have a requirement to actually do like a gender-based violence background check to make sure that that person has no cases or no history, and you're allowed to ask that question to your references as a person puts forward their case, whether for boards or for positions. And so this is something that I think we should be pushing for. And I think in terms of, I see a question that is addressed to me in the chat from Tina.
Yes.
Shall I go ahead and answer that one?
Can you respond to that?
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Trust Tina to ask that question, but it's a very good.
Go ahead.
I think the big thing is that, first and foremost, of course, sitting in South Africa, it looks like it is way worse than everywhere else. South Africa's violence is particularly bad because in relation to the violent nature of it. And what for us is clear is that this is not unique to gender violence. It is actually a sort of culture of violence that has been for a very long time. So that's the one point, and it's not to justify it, but it's to say that that's one thing that we see differentiates South Africa from many other countries. I mean, the irony of this whole story is that just now during COVID, the data we've collected outside of South Africa has shown 30% increase in gender-based violence in Europe. So it's not just us who are suffering from this kind of work, but that doesn't justify the 50 women killed in 50 days. So I think there's a couple of things. The one is the nature of the violence in South Africa, and that's something that is so important to look at, so that we are dealing with the culture of violence in particular. And so that's one piece of work. And I think a lot of our response has assumed, and we sort of in many ways lump together all forms of violence as if they are all forms of GBV, as if they're at equal level. And you know, even though you have laws obviously for murder and killings, but in real terms, the kind of violence that comes with a lot of South Africa's gender-based violence has not been treated as such. So there isn't the kind of the way we would behave if we were in a civil war, and you know there's a civil war, and we need to make sure that we're dealing with crime at a very serious level, which is why I talked about the importance of beginning to shift a lot of attention to the local level, because we know perpetrators, we know who are abusers. In general, we know who they are. There are a few cases where they're like serial killers, but in general, we kind of know who around our community are violent, and we say nothing about it. So if we look at South Africa's interventions in terms of failing, that's one of the things I would say. Another thing I would say is that, you know, we've looked at the police. We did an assessment as part of the Emergency Response Action Plan, and we looked at what's missing in the police. And what we found is that, first of all, it's very hierarchical. And so the length of time it takes to make quick decisions at the police station seems to be weaker than elsewhere. So I think in other countries we found that police, a commander of a police station has the power to make quick decisions without having to constantly sort of pass on the decisions to higher levels within the police service. So there is some work around management, a lot of work around management, supervision, accountability at each local police station that needs to happen. So that's at the one level. At another level, what we see as a really weak point compared to other countries who have effective gender-based violence responses are the assumptions that the reporting structures that are in place are sufficient to respond to the kind of demand that there is from women. In other words, the GBV Command Center, the police, I mean, these are great initiatives and you've got wonderful lines and they're all well intended. But what we know more and more, and Tamara and I are involved in rapid response teams, is that women don't report there in large numbers. Some women do, but many women do not report there. If you think about yourself and any friends that you know who have been in any case of violence, did they run to the police or did they call you and tell you about a threat of violence? And so what happens then is that a woman calls her friend or she calls a relative or she calls a church member and they sort of try to deal with it at a local level without the proper tools and don't end up dealing with it. And lo and behold, you end up having violence. In many of the cases that you have seen actual killings, when you track back the case, there had been an attempt one way or the other for them to report this case. But the system, or the individuals were not able to take it through a system that responded fast enough. So there needs to be an ecosystem for me. There needs to be a rethink of the reporting ecosystem from the perspective of the woman, not from the perspective of the institution, because many times, we say, oh, Discovery has now just released a new response line. That's great. But does that make the reasons why women are not reporting to the GBV Command Center any easier or any better? Because if they're not responding because they're fearful of intimate partner violence, which is the largest amount of violence that we experience, then they're still not going to report, but they might whisper to their friend or their neighbor or someone else through codes, right? So we have to design a system that understands that kind of context and that dynamic. And then again, my big point is we have not invested in prevention at all. Tina, we have not invested in prevention. We're focusing on response. The investment in prevention is weak, very, very weak. And that's something that we have to do before we start having to go catch cases and we find dead bodies. Prevent them, and we know how to. Many of the tavern owners who told us they know who their abusers are. They even know the guys who have killed. They know them. They know them, but they just, it's a domestic matter. So we have to change that culture that sits and watches as violence takes place in a community where it could be different. But the National Strategic Plan has got all the pillars that we need to be able to establish a global best practice.
Thank you, Anne. There's another.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Anne. There is another question here that is pointed at yourself. It says, the point about placing responsibility with men in leadership, like heads of state and CEOs, to ensure social justice is a key missing link. We need to strengthen and harness this, given the agency on GBV. I think this is part of the accountability and leadership that needs to be added as an input from IWFSA. Thank you very much. In terms of summarizing, I'm conscious of time. In terms of summarizing, in terms of what we have discussed, is Ms. Tamara highlighted us the journey in terms of the GBV, and then the NSP as a foundation document in a response to GBV, which has highlighted the 6 strategic priorities, being the accountability and leadership, prevention, justice and safety, response care and support, economic power, and research. So those are the 6 pillars in which, as IWFSA, I think we are key to be part of that. And then Ms. Anne just highlighted that to us the best practice. And what I like about that is the key that resonate with me is the supply chain as a response to GBV. I think we need a discussion around that as a separate conversation. And then also the fact that in terms of the CPIC, I think we need to put that as an input to make sure that the change in the Companies Act, in terms, if you are a perpetrator of GBV, you make sure that you don't occupy a leadership position. And then the issue of the sexual offenders register in the workplace, that is very important to end up not having the same issue that has happened with the post office sort of scenario, whereby you have a sexual offender who is working in different organizations and really offending in terms of the customers. And then I like also what Ms. Anne has highlighted in terms of that is a culture that we have not invested in terms of the prevention. Prevention is key, and then those are some of the things that we need to take as an input as IWFSA members. So to the members of IWFSA, what I would like to say, thank you very much for participating in terms of today's session. If members are interested in participating in the pillars that Ms. Tamara has highlighted, they can send their details to Akita at admin@iwfsa.co.za, and then we will be able to take them forward in terms of the committees that the Department of Women and Children is actually spearheading in terms of dealing with each and every pillar. And I think in the month of August, they're going to launch the 100 days in terms of what needs to be done in terms of each and every pillar. It will be very important for IWFSA to participate in that. I just want to say thank you very much to the panelists. I think it was a very good conversation, very good, educated ourselves, especially in terms of this broad issue, and also the issue is that what can we do as women in terms of in ensuring that we can reduce this gender-based violence, and then wherever we are, to make sure that in the communities that we operate in, communities that we touch, to make sure that this gender-based violence is actually addressed. Thank you very much, everybody. Really appreciate it. Last bit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Taifosa. Thank you to everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I look forward to the partnership.
We were going to be with you for a long, long time.
You're stuck with us. And yeah, and you know, we already had a meeting of the conveners today. We missed you.
Oh my goodness, we were stressing about this with load shedding.
Yeah.
So Tamara and please bear with us. We're really gonna be on the long haul with you.